Hi everyone. I think we can probably start the evening now. Just one. Yeah. Sorry, I've had so. Hi everyone. I think we've got 1:06. Maybe we'll wait another 30 seconds for a few more people to come. Yeah. So while I'm waiting for everyone to come along, I'm promoting you all to panelists, which means it gives you the option to turn on your camera, which I'd encourage because then it's a bit more like a conversation, but you can also keep your camera off. We've had a question just now on how you can change the way you view the webinar. In the top right corner, you've got a button which says view, which means you can have either as gallery view or as speaker view, which means that if you have it as gallery view, you can see everyone attending, or speaker view, you only see the person speaking. While you've got your camera on, I'd ask you to keep the sound turned off for the moment, so we don't have too much noise. But yeah. Oh, hello everyone. Yeah. So thanks everyone very much for joining our Voices for Scotland get together tonight. We're very happy that we've got Jerry Hassan joining us tonight. Here he is. Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. Before we start with the get together, I'm just going to say a few words about Voices for Scotland for those of you who do not know anything about us, and also a bit about Zoom. So we're using Zoom as a webinar function, which is just a technicality. It just means that we're just promoting you all to panelists at the moment. If you've got any technicality questions, just go into the chat and write a message to either Voices for Scotland or Alan Voices for Scotland, and we'll try and help you with any technical questions or issues you might have. So if you just keep your microphones turned off while you're not speaking, but then once later we go into the discussion and conversation, just turn it on. It's nice seeing everyone's faces now. It's always, the first few moments are always a bit strange when all you see is yourself and it feels a bit like I'm just talking to myself. Yes, so Voices for Scotland, I'm Clara. I'm one of the campaign organisers. We've got Alan here as well, who's got his camera off just now. And we are a non-party political civic organisation campaigning for Scottish independence. What we've been trying to do, even throughout lockdown and now this current state that we're in, which is probably a pre-lockdown again, or depending on the place you are in the country, a proper lockdown, we're trying to facilitate big and small conversations. So one of the things we're doing is these weekly get-togethers. So thanks very much for joining us tonight. We're currently supported by regular donations. So if you'd like to support our work so we can keep going, please consider donating to us. If you can't donate at the moment, please share our stuff on social media. Every like counts, every share counts, just helps us to spread the word a wee bit more. And yeah, so we'd appreciate that as well. Yeah, if you have any questions during the conversation, you can either write into the chat, or you can also write into the Q&A. And then once we're at the Q&A session, we can actually ask the question in person as well. So, but now for the man you're actually here tonight, because I'm sure I've been talking too much anyways, we're very happy that we've got Jerry Hassan joining us tonight. He was actually requested in previous get-together, so I'm very happy that we actually managed to get him. Jerry is a Scottish journalist, writer and author, so I'm sure many of you will have seen what he's been writing anyways. We also had a wee blog that we had shared before the get-together tonight, but he's also written several books. And yeah, we're really lucky because he's basically a very, very good Scottish commentator on Scottish current history. So I'm sure tonight will be an interesting discussion. Tonight we'll talk about independence as the new normal, and especially how it's still important to stay open-minded and open-hearted to those who have not made up their opinion that independence is the right way for Scotland or not. But I'm going to hand over now, and if you've got any questions, just let me know.
Okay, yeah, you're handing over to me, Clara.
Yes, to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Clara. And thank you, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. It's always a funny experience speaking in into the cyber world. I'm going to talk for about 15, maybe maximum 20 minutes. And obviously, there's going to be some element of simplicity here because I'm trying to cover a lot of ground about how independence is changing and consequences for that for independence and understanding the union argument as well. Huge challenges to that, obviously. I mean, I do think, starting with that obvious point, that independence has become normal, become the mainstream. That's quite a fundamental shift. I think it's, at least in the foreseeable future, an irreversible one, in the sense that I don't mean independence going to necessarily win automatically, but just that it is the mainstream argument. It's a normal argument in Scottish public life and an idea. And from that, I think lots and lots of consequences flow for modern Scotland. It changes how independence has to be. It changes the argument for the union and how that has to be if it is to have any success or just cut through on any level. I think it changes the nation of Scotland and how we see ourselves. And it changes the UK in ways I think it both, you know, has issues with and kind of resistance to. So it brings a bigger responsibility to Indie. And so what I want to do is just to explore some of those things and then how it changes the argument. First, I think independence isn't in this necessarily but just the headline figures or even the you know, dynamic of 9 polls in a row. It's about independence as an idea. Now, independence as an idea is different from the SNP's offer. I still take the view that in 2014, the idea of independence kind of won the debate in that obviously independence lost the vote, but that a whole part of Scotland, including lots of soft no voters, we've got great, you know, survey evidence on this, they really liked the idea of independence. They just, why wouldn't you? Independence is a good thing, standing on your own 2 feet, taking responsibility, etc. And a significant part of the no vote didn't vote yes because of there was various details they didn't like on the economy, or there was the issue of Alex Salmond to some, and there was a couple of other issues as well, the main salient issues. But that was quite significant, and that has become even more so since 2014, part of that fundamental shift. So a couple of areas I think in which independence has to sort of think about and change its argument. One is there's success here, but success means, you know, you have to build on that and not take it for granted. The drivers for Indie in the last poll showed that 64% of people thought Scotland and England were heading in different political directions, and 63% said they don't trust the UK government to act in the best interests of Scotland. Hardly surprising, these figures. But if you want to get into a real sustainable winning position, and I'm talking here about my experience of the '97 referendum when I was involved in polling on that before the referendum, you need to push those figures further up into at least the 70s. I mean, when we won the '97 referendum, those sort of figures we had figures in the high 70s, in the 80s on things, practically, you know, practically consensus, apart from a small part of the Tory vote. And 55% of people still have huge concerns about independence and the Scottish economy. That figure needs to be, the negatives need to be driven down as well. Second thing is the issue of leadership. As we all know, Boris Johnson's hugely unpopular, you know, 76% unpopularity in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon, hugely popular. Those figures might not always remain. What happens if Boris Johnson, you know, highly likely it goes before the next election? It is just possible he may be, you know, succeeded by a leader who is, you know, significantly less unpopular. What happens if there's a transition to a post-Sturgeon leadership before the next referendum? Indie's also got to come up with more detail. I know some of us get a bit bashed on this sometimes, but there are serious questions behind, you know, the finances, the debt, you know, the perennial currency question, Europe. And I think as much as the detail, it's kind of how they're answered that matters. So for some of us, we all understood why the white paper emerged last time. There was a whole host of reasons. The SNP hadn't thought they would win a majority in 2011. So they had to suddenly produce all this evidence and a kind of story and a vision of Scotland. Obviously, the main offer of independence comes from the Scottish government, but we can't have it just being, it needs to be more widely owned somehow the white paper, the answers that we come up with collectively on those questions. I think the ownership issue is as much important. Obviously, the detail matters as well. And a problem for independents a bit from success, 13 years of the SNP in office, is that independence cannot be synonymous with the status quo of present day Scotland. Some SNP supporters fall into this all the time. They defend every single thing that's going on in present day Scotland that's the responsibility of the Scottish Government. It's, it's the thing that you can find some people defending, a train that's not been cancelled or something from, the Inverness Perth line or something. That is a disastrous pitfall to fall into. Independence has to be about change. And a wee controversial example on this from the present day, which is much worse, of course, is the example of Donald Trump. And obviously we have nothing in common with Donald Trump, but Donald Trump ran, obviously fakely, but Donald Trump ran as an insurgent in 2016. I was there, I was at his rallies. However, grotesque he is, he stood for something in 2016, and Hillary Clinton stood for some kind of ambivalence. And so Trump now finds, with all the other stuff as well, that he cannot run as an outsider. He's the sitting president, he's, all the other stuff as well. And what it kind of shows is you cannot, when you're in office for quite a period, you cannot run as an insurgency, which we did in 2014. We're going to have much, much more difficulty doing that next time. And so there's a balancing act needed here. We cannot be the status quo, because that's a disaster. And yet at the same time, we cannot just be this automatic insurgency. So there's a navigation needed there. And probably different kind of independence messages as well, but it definitely needs some thinking through that's kind of beyond this wee bit at the moment. Maybe we can get into. And running through all this again as well, I think was one of the great unexplored areas of 2014. Is even more so. Independence is about psychology, because it unleashes all sorts of stuff in people: hopes, fears, emotions, and issues around risk and uncertainty. And underneath all that in 2014, and more so now, is who manages the risk and how do you deal with it, and who do you trust most, etc. And do you trust collectively the people of Scotland? And I think there was a kind of missing issue in 2014 of the risk in independence, because the risk is something about us having confidence in ourselves. So we need to, there needs to be a wee bit of movement and advance on that. So I also think winning in politics is about understanding your opponents. And Ben Jackson wrote a very good book on this, which is not a pro-independence book, but called The Case for Scottish Independence, an academic book just out, where he said that, I think completely right here, I think, that over the last 40 years, pro-union sentiment has consistently stereotyped independence. They've assumed basically that we're all Nats, we're all in flags and symbols, and if not Bruce and Bannockburn, other stuff, and looking into the past. Indeed, there was a historian, Richard Tomes, presenting this exact case last weekend in The Spectator. And what he says is they never understood the main argument, how independence has become mainstream is about democratic legitimacy, obviously, and who do you trust to run Scotland. But similarly, independence, as it moves into this winning position, we have to be careful not to be hoisted by our own success here and overconfidence, because there is a trap that we know of and we see of stereotyping all pro-union opinion. Just as all pro-independence opinion isn't Scottish nationalist, clearly all pro-union opinion isn't unionist. It can be, just the fact of they don't believe in the case for independence, or are not yet convinced, or have other attachments to Britain which might not be unionist, because unionism is something that drives some of them mad, of course. Unionism is a form of nationalism. And a good friend of mine, an indie blogger, said this to me last year, and she just came up with this off the top of her head, which she said, there's no such thing as no voters. There's no such thing as no voters. There's only people who voted no. And I actually think that is both brilliant. It's not completely correct, because there are people who are fanatical no voters, like there's on our side. But as a philosophy of life, I just love that. And that's how I like to think of how I do my politics. No such thing as no voters, Doesn't mean they're all on the road, not yes yet, because there's a little bit of, I personally think, a little bit of sanctimoniousness in that. But, we're not going to convince every single person in Scotland, but I just love that. So, points on the argument for the union and how to defeat it. There's the power of British identity and Britishness. This gets to the point of the union question as an existential one. And I really don't think the independence debate is about thinking you're Scottish or British or the prioritisation of that. When, if we become independent, a British dimension will remain in Scotland. We will have had 300 years of British history. There will be pan-British, systems of cooperation. The Irish example is rather germane here. Ireland remained with systems of cooperation, and even after the final break in 1949, remained in the travel to work area, etc., etc. The solidarity with Sunderland argument, which is about the class above nation argument, you hear it a lot. But class solidarity is international and not about borders. And I always think there's an example of several British trade unions, including Unite, actually organise in the UK and in Ireland, and the same would be true in independent Scotland. There's the pooling and sharing argument. I'm going to go back to this in a second, which is about obviously one of the most unequal countries in the world, and kind of about trying to say, why do you want to leave a dependency culture? We will sort of look after you, etc. And don't you dare, why are you not grateful for that? There's the argument that Scotland can't afford a welfare state of these standards. We couldn't afford to rescue banks in 2008. We couldn't afford the COVID-19 support. And this gets down to a kind of argument which is seems to come down to big is beautiful. Clearly big is not beautiful, depends what you do with the big. And small is somehow problematic, whereas we know that the most successful countries in the world on sort of COVID, a lot of them have been small. Denmark, New Zealand being the second one. So it's what you do with your public policy, what you prioritise, not the size. And the final one, I think, here is that we are safe in the UK. This is, I think, we're in a world that is increasingly, there are lots of risks and threats. China, Russia, terrorism, whether the United States ever stops being, what it is at the moment, we're going to hear more of. And that implies that somehow we should cling to the global foreign policy and global position of the UK, which is, to put it mildly, I think, part of the problem. And that we couldn't chart our own course, which is part of a more mature, progressive international politics. But I think, just to return to this point about pooling and sharing, what that does, I think, and I think this is really, personally, a disastrous approach for the union argument. It reduces the union to a sort of, basically, a transactional nationalism, which goes along the lines of, we identify, whatever you think of the figures here, we identify that about £1,975 supposedly per head comes from UK to Scotland. Now, this is, of course, those figures are open to question, but what I think it misses is so much it misses, apart from bringing it down to money, is what happens when a right-wing Tory government starts to undermine Barnett? Because if we continue to have right-wing Tory governments in the UK and they get more right-wing, Barnett's not going to remain. Barnett is going to be, diluted, already has been diluted by previous Tory government or put under attack. 10 years of austerity, that has a per head impact on Scotland, and a no-deal Brexit, and indeed the cost of Brexit already. So that's a terrible position for the union to put itself in. So just some quick final thoughts on what that does about the argument. We are in an asymmetrical debate. It's not a debate of equals, because independent supporters are up for this for obvious reasons. The union side doesn't really want to have this argument, and that plays into massively the dynamics of this debate. And also that a large part of the union argument really doesn't understand the argument and doesn't understand where the independence case is coming from. But I still think, and this is a note of caution here, I've got two sort of final points here. Don't underestimate the UK government, because we all do it at points. We all are guilty at points of playing into an othering of the UK state, which is, the way it's behaving at the moment, pretty understandable. But it could just act in a strategic way. You saw the Tory wargaming this week, which again didn't have much in it. But it is possible this is what they should have done after 2014. They could call a new union vote before a pro-independence vote. They could get in before there's an independence vote, and pose a new kind of settlement to the Scots, which would have to be, you know, obviously very, very comprehensive and worked out. I'm thinking that's possibly, probably not going to happen, but it is true that as their take of Britain and Scotland's place in it declines, there still is an element of intelligence in the British establishment, in a small part of the British political classes, in things like the intelligence and security forces, who these people, whatever people think about the United Kingdom, these people do not want Scotland to leave. It's one, it's about an idea of Britain that's in decline admittedly, and secondly, it's about a geopolitical idea of Britain. It's how Britain fits into their version of the world, and so on, defence, foreign policy, diplomacy, prestige, you know, those sort of things. So just don't underestimate it. And that then requires no complacency from the independent side, because I think sometimes there is a little bit of sense of thinking, you know, that we're only on one way, one gradient on the way to, you know, victory, etc., etc. And this cannot be. There are signs, or, you know, what would you say, things that are not entirely completely as great as they should be on the independent side. The SNP have been in office 13 years. That brings political cost with it. There is the, you know, maybe Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. There's too much, what we don't say, too much political capital put into that. And that comes with, you know, people are human. They tire, etc. They make mistakes. And similarly, there's a kind of like a carping in part of the independence movement as well. But, you know, why can't we have independence, you know, now practically, why can't we declare UDI, which would be illegal basically as far as I can work out. And it's about how we have that wider independence culture that I've called independence of the Scottish mind. And I think that this is where I'll end on this point at the moment, is that Fintan O'Toole's argument about this when he was writing about Ireland's example and the Scottish independence debate in 2014, he said, independence is about the art of growing up. And I love that phrase, because what he means is it's about acknowledging your shortcomings, that, you know, we're not perfect, we won't be perfect in independence, but we take responsibility for who we are. And that does require that we do a different politics and a different independence from 2014, and really, in a way, probably a different politics from what we've done in the last 6 years. We've had lots of successes, but there's still lots more to do to get to that independent Scotland. So I'll end there at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great. I really enjoyed reading the article that you had also posted on your blog, and the idea really resonates with me that we shouldn't consider all the no voters as unionists or as unions, etc. Because even just in my close group of friends, I've got quite a lot of people who were no voters in the past, but they were so far off from being a unionist that you know, you immediately alienate them. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we keep highlighting that, and yeah, keep remembering that. So we've already had a bit of questions in the chat, but if you'd like to ask any questions just now or comment with comments, just let me know. We've got Alan as well looking, so you can physically raise your hand or you can also write in the chat. But I'll just have a quick look at the chat box now. Okay, so is there anyone who wants to ask a question in person right now? Otherwise, we've got a comment from Robert Ingram in context of the institution. No. Robert, do you want to come in yourself and ask the question, or would you like me to read it out? I'll ask to unmute you.
Right, I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Good. Right, my question is, an independent Scotland, and it is coming, Jerry. It may be a couple of years yet, but it is coming. An independent Scotland is going to require a written constitution. And historically in Scotland, it's been the concept that the people are the supreme authority. And this stems back from the Declaration of Arbroath. Now, a written constitution should therefore have input from the people who actually authorize it. It's not sufficient just to leave it to the politicians, because, well, I'm sure we have some good politicians up there.
Mm.
but we also have a lot who are not so very good. And we are actually, our written constitution grants powers for the operation of the nation and the protection and the rights of the people. At the present moment, there is no capability, there's no facility for the people themselves to actually set out what their views are. Now, the charity Constitution for Scotland has actually set out a platform whereby anyone in Scotland can go onto their website and have their say. We set out a model constitution which was being created over a period of about 11 years. A lot of people have inputted into it. And according to actual Dr. Elliot Bulmar, it's about time that it went to actually public review, which is what we did on the 1st of September. We actually want to give everybody in Scotland the opportunity to have their say in this constitution. Would you support such a constitution?
Yes, of course. Thank you for that, Robert. That was fantastically, just totally, you know, on one of the most fundamental issues facing us. I think you both. You mean I don't disagree with single word you've said, and I think we obviously the point you made about the input from the people being, you know, where do people have a way to say how they are governed and the rules they make and decisions made in Scotland. How do they do that? Absolutely right. And the fact that we cannot have a version of independence in our future created just by the politicians. I mean, it also chimes with there's a move, as you know, to a more popular constitutionalism across the world. Secondly, the great Scottish tradition of that. And I think there is a fantastic history there. I mean, there's even histories, as you will know all this, of course, that some of our history people even don't know. We had a history of direct democracy on things like on temperance and between dry and wet areas. Scotland kind of was, if not led the world, I don't want to be into that sort of triumphalism, but we were one of the leaders in the world in direct democracy. So I completely agree with you. And what I even think more is that because various Labour people I know or pro-union people, as I try and get my phraseology right, will say to me, oh, Scotland and SNP, we don't do accountability. I don't think we've ever really done accountability because people in Scotland are part of a union that is, the United Kingdom's not a democracy, and people across Britain feel strangers in their own home, and that's even more so in Scotland. So I absolutely think your thing is timely, and I know the work of Elliot Bulmer as well, very well. So well done on that. And have you had much comeback from politicians on it? Not that they're the, you know, Robert.
The politicians don't want to know at the present moment in time. And quite frankly, we're not interested. Because at the present moment, we want to actually get the people themselves, the grassroots, the power. One of the best examples of people power is currently happening right now during the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
The politicians may be coming out with their overall policies, etc., but the real work is being done and initiated by the people in the communities.
But totally.
And that is where our strength is. Let's bear in mind that in Scotland, the bulk of people operate in small and single jobs. It's not the big corporations. Unfortunately, our politicians listen to the big corporations.
Yeah. Well,
instead of the ordinary people.
Yeah,
we want the people's voice to be heard. And it's not going to be perfect. It will have to be gone through and scrutinized legally, etc., but done properly. I'm sorry, I don't have enough respect for the political regime to actually say, let's leave it to them. There's a lot of people doing. But the reality is, they're no different from us. And there's many of them do not have our worldly experience.
Yes. I also think just that the wider point I would make, I mean, again, I'm in complete agreement with you. I mean, I do think it's a tough act some for people that are decent trying to be politicians, but I just don't want to be living in independent Scotland where it's about the SNP's vision or language. My whole adult life has been, you know, the normal powers, full powers of a normal parliament. I actually find that quite an unattractive view at all. I want to live in a Scotland that's independent where the parliament has less power And we have self-governing communities. We have a local democracy worthy of its name. And
Yeah.
Robert, you're absolutely right. When I was doing something last week with Compass, the centre-left think tank, and they asked me this great question at the end, what gives me hope at the moment? We're talking about Scotland, but just what gives me hope? I mean, I meant in a wider sense. And, you know, it's a tough question. And I said exactly something along the lines you're saying, that in the area I live in on Glasgow South Side, the wealth of, in the real sense of the word, of self-organising people, putting other people first, you know, looking after each other, doing food runs, you know, just offering support in all sorts of ways, practical, emotional, and others. And I mean, it's obviously multiple times true about Westminster, but how I hate words like learning curve, but how that version of Scotland feeds back into government, to the fact that it's a completely different take. Because, I mean, Andy Whiteman's been very good on this, but it is true that the centralisation of Scotland predates the Scottish Parliament, predates Thatcher, and has been going on since probably about the 1929 local government reorganisation. And as the Scottish states got bigger, which began long before the Scottish Parliament, they've been, in an understandable way, pushing and shoving to take up more public room. That's kind of understandable in a dynamic way, or a system dynamic way, but eventually, I mean, I think it has reached its point of like, you know, no return in a way, and so we have to come up with a version of independence and a version of the future that treats people as adults. So I'm fully with you, Robert. So thank you.
Yeah, the actual at this present moment, Scotland is the most centralised country as far as governance is concerned in the whole of Europe.
Yeah. We
have less elected representation than any other country in Europe. I believe Andy Whiteman actually came out, or no, not Andy Whiteman, Commonweal came out with, or was it before then, Reed Foundation.
Yeah.
They came out with the silent crisis, etc. But one of the best examples of small government we could see in Germany, which is probably one of the most democratically divided down. They split their government authority, where we have it all in the parliament, they have it in about 3 or 4 levels. Now, you may recall when Alex Salmond froze the actual council tax.
Yeah.
My niece actually lives in Germany and has lived in Germany for about 25 years. And she was telling me that Angela Merkel, reputedly the most powerful politician in Europe, discussed actually doing the same thing in Germany. And she was told by local government, no, that's our business, it's not yours.
Yeah.
Now that is democracy. And that is what we are advocating in our constitution.
Yes.
Multiple tiered, with clear, defined authority at local level.
Well, thank you, and I'll happily support you. So thank you.
We had a question. Well, we had a few questions coming in. Alex McCulloch was actually asking whether the Citizen Assembly is a reference for the Constitution draft at the moment. The Citizen Assembly is actually coming up quite a lot in our get-togethers, always as a good example of including a wide range and diverse and representative group of people of Scotland to form a vision of Scotland. So for those of you who are not aware of it, I think what they've done was they got around 100 people that were representative completely of the demographic cut through of Scotland, got them together, and over the course of several months had sort of workshops with them on what they would like the future of Scotland to look like in a non-political context, but just in a purely civic view. And hence the question, I guess, whether that has had any influence on the Constitution, which I think is a very good question, because it's always good when we have civic organizations coming in and representing people, not always political groups.
Yeah.
The other question we had from Jane Jones, I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself. If you wait, I'll unmute you. Should be unmuted now? Not yet. Yes,
okay.
Now.
Yeah, this is not a different question, I guess, Jerry, but it was about when you first talked about insurgent leadership and those that have been around for a while. I thought it quite interesting one, because I just wondered what you felt about the COVID era and how Sturgeon obviously has been handling that, whether people, because it's been such a weird time and very insecure and anxious, whether you think people would appreciate those they know, as it were, that's done a decent job, rather than at this moment going for something like an insurgent, if you might describe it like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm still sort of thinking about this, because, and this is despite, I'm just to do a wee puff here with Simon Barrow. I've just edited a book called Scotland After the Virus, which is out in about a month. Which the biggest debate with the publisher was whether that was a risky title, right? Because it's a hope, and a projection, and an imagination, and a little bit of a provocation. And despite, you know, I've read and edited all the chapters, and I'm still, it's just made me think even more the area around the question you're talking about. It seems to me that, I mean, we commissioned people, a whole variety of people that weren't just necessarily political here. We commissioned short story writers, poets, and people talking about personal stuff. And it just seems that the emotional tapestry of things that have been released by COVID are so much wider and profound than what normal politics is about. So, you know, it's about life, love, death, you know, the obvious things. And there's lots of wonderful stories. I mean, I also got each one of my 40 contributors to tell me anonymously how COVID had affected them, or not, you know. And it's amazing that the insights that I think. How do we as a nation deal with this rich tapestry that, where I'm saying like yesterday, I was conscious of the fact, you know, the BAFTAs in Scotland have lost a whole host of you know, areas of production, and in lots of areas we face cultural wastelands. You know, we face, you know, wider poverty, etc., stretched public services. Yet at the same time, there's lots of relationships that have shifted, and I do think that, I mean, I don't know if you agree. I think Nicola Sturgeon has done something here, but, you know, there's lots of mistakes in it and all that. But I have recognised a public decency and public duty and listening to experts that, you know, we've got lots of things we've done wrong on COVID, but I think she's tried her best, and I'm just generally, unless people are like lying horrors like, you know, Boris Johnson, I'm prepared to give people the benefit of the doubt. But I think there's a thing there as well, but she takes the weight on her own shoulders too much. We've got a centralised government, we've got a kind of centralised leadership, and yet there's this rich Scotland that, you know, going back to our previous discussion with Robert, that I'd like to see that nurtured a bit more, because it does need nurtured. It needs supported and encouraged and brought into full life in a way. We cannot, I mean, I already think Scotland's partly independent in the way it thinks about itself, but to get to that final, you know, to become independent and to become a nation isn't just like we have a government that's a bit like, you know, the version of Westminster, but slightly better. We have to have a different kind of relationship between institutions and us as citizens, obviously, not subjects.
I felt I really enjoyed how she's done it. I'm not an SNP member, but I just really get quite moved sometimes the way she describes things. And she does seem to draw on this idea of solidarity as against individualism and so on, and speaks in a way that I feel does bring us together, actually. I really admire her, I have to say, and a real supporter. Now, you know, I don't mean she should be in office forever, but I feel, I suppose it's ironic, isn't it? A kind of safe pair of hands. Quite like a cautiousness, actually, in this moment, and given all the kind of divisions that seem to be burbling up around the whole idea of independence, it just feels kind of quite an uncertain time, actually.
Yeah, no, I think that is completely. I mean, we're not going to get out of this pandemic for, you know, at least until, you know, what, spring, summer next year at the earliest. So this is like a watershed we're all living through, and I don't know if it's just my nature or not. I don't find it that surprising in a way. Well, I do obviously on one level, but given that, you know, one of the biggest threats the UK government they had on their risk register, whatever it was a pandemic, and the same was true of the Barack Obama White House, and you know, Trump famously threw away the handbook and abolished the Working Party and so on. We're just going to come out of it rightly completely changed. And when actually my first answer to the Compass question last week, before I got onto the you know, direct stuff of lived life, is I've always felt the neoliberal model. I mean, I know it's a bit of a boo-hoo word now, it's used all the time, but we do live in the age of a global neoliberal order. The SNP are a bit complicit with that. You know, the Growth Commission isn't, I think, a very attractive view of the model. I don't want public affairs lobbyists running Scotland. I don't want people who are lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, claiming they're not corporate lobbyists and making public policy. That's very Westminster. But that global order is unsustainable, and it is inhumane and disastrous. And if we could undermine it, pull it up, and challenge those institutional, you know, views of the world in Scotland as well as elsewhere, you know, some good may come out of this disaster. But we're going to have to come up with a different. I mean, I know there's lots of good economic and social thinking, but we're going to have to embed it in institutions and government.
Great, thank you very much. We have actually, is there anyone else who's got a question right now? Otherwise, we've got a question oh yeah, Alistair, I'll just unmute you. Oh, should be unmuted now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello. Yeah, I posted a question in the chat. A letter in the National today quoted you as suggesting a deal could be done to leave Faslane to London. So, can you clarify your position, Jerry, on what should happen to Faslane after independence, and your thoughts on Scotland's membership of NATO, and basically what Scotland's defence would.
Have you frozen there?
Hello.
Yeah, I think you're just frozen. We'll
I think I got the gist of that.
Yeah.
I can.
Hi. Did you get that?
Yes, I did. I'll try and answer you as fully as possible.
I put,
Go on.
okay.
Have you?
Yeah. Sorry. Do you want me to read the question again?
No. I got it all. Non-nuclear Scotland,
Okay.
no membership, right? Right. First point.
Yeah.
I obviously completely support a non-nuclear Scotland. Nuclear weapons are just, apart from the moral argument, right? The idea of an independent British nuclear deterrent is just a farce, as we know. You know, they're not independent. You know, etc., etc. But how we get to a non-nuclear Scotland is the question I think we just need to debate. And there is, as in a lot of areas on independence, right? I think there is what's the word? A wariness of the SNP leadership to face up to like the issues of the difficult decisions that are going to have to be faced post-independence. And one of them is on the nuclear weapons. That this is an obvious point. When Scotland votes for independence, you know, so let's say 2 years down the line after that, we become formally independent. It'll probably even be like with the EU, some kind of transitional period or so on. But we become formally independent. The nuclear weapons in Faslane, and importantly as well, Coalport, the Coalport site, don't stop on day one of independence. There will have to be an element of negotiation between the Scottish independent state and the RUK state. And my argument our point is that gives us, I mean, it's just an obvious point that needs to be said, that gives us a huge bargaining chip with the UK state about how those weapons and nuclear facilities leave Faslane and Coalport. Now, in that, the analogy I used once before was, which just needs to be discussed is that it's not an accident that Ireland, in brutal circumstances of colonialism and military occupation, how did Ireland leave the United Kingdom? It left it by agreement debt-free. Just let me say debt-free. And how did it do that? Because in the 1921-22 treaty, the Ireland negotiated the lease back of 3 West Coast ports, which were leased from 1922 till the British government, to Churchill's horror, in 37-38 gave them back, because these were for, you know, submarines and, you know, use in the West Atlantic. And what it means is that for us negotiating a period, we can A, reduce our debt potentially, and secondly, there is the issue of when those nukes go from Faslane or Coalport, whatever, short period, there is the issue here of whether we could make the United Kingdom debt-free. And I would like to see Scotland, you know, nuclear-free, United Kingdom nuclear-free, because I don't just want to see the nukes sail out of Faslane. And I think in that, you know, let me just say on this, I don't have firm political positions on every single issue in the world, surprisingly. And I am neutral on the issue of NATO membership. What I particularly see is, if one is leaving the United Kingdom, because there's various things of the SNP's independence version I regard as really unsavoury. I mean, like the currency position the last time. But to leave this union and to remain in NATO, at least for a period, because to leave NATO at the same time and to risk the wrath of the geopolitical interests in not just the UK, but in Washington as well and other places in the world, I think it's possibly just a little bit, my political judgment is a little bit too much to take on. And I personally wouldn't recommend it. I'm no friend or supporter of NATO, and I'm obviously no supporter of nuclear weapons. I think they're grotesque. Sooner out there, the better. Clearly, they're not there with the consent of the Scottish people, etc., etc. But I do think there's a little bit of a view on independence. They probably sail out within. I mean, I've had people say to me they sail out in day one or year one. It's just not going to happen. And there's a, what's the word? I don't want to use the word cowardice. There's an inability, lack of what's the word? Bravery and honesty in the SNP leadership to face up to some of these issues, because it's about probably maximising the independence vote. I get that, but I don't want people to feel let down the day after we vote for independence, or then the day after we become independent. That's my thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else got any question right now who would like to ask them? Alex, yeah, just unmute yourself.
Evening, everyone.
Evening.
Thanks, Jerry, for the input. I have a whole pad full of questions here, but actually I'm not going to ask them. I'm just going to sort of raise a thought, because we could talk all night on the questions. It seems that this is a useful forum, and maybe my input is that maybe we have to have specific topics, when we have a guest or Jerry, so that we can drill down on a topic and be prepared and produce something. I see Isabel's comment there about having a month where we focus on the Constitution and try and shape something. And at the moment, naively or otherwise, I believe and hope that a referendum will be next autumn. So there's not a lot of time for us to get really solid in some of the basics, be that currency, be it borders or whatever. And we need to kind of wake up and smell the coffee and get solutions to these. I don't believe we have to be definitive. I think if we're smart, we can have a sort of 3-2-1 approach to say, when we're independent, these are the three main ways we will approach welfare. So we can say, today in welfare, we have the UK version of universal credit. We don't believe the Scottish citizens are satisfied with that. At a Scottish government level, we have £10 child payment, where we've enhanced it and something better. But in an independent Scotland, we believe we can have pensions at the European average, something like that, where we don't tie ourselves to any specific, but we show people that there will be options. There'll be political differences as to what we do, but we don't have to hang our hat on one version and then be torn apart by the unionists. We can show the options that we'll have in Scotland. But I think these forums, Voices for Scotland, maybe we have a subject each week where we can try and develop the things together and with people like Jerry's input, so that we leave each session with maybe something that we can then go and share with no voters or people who voted no, as Jerry has educated us with. So it was just some input there as to how we proceed from tonight, rather than talk all over the place every week.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Actually, so I don't know if you've seen recently, so the Scottish Independence Convention, which is the overarching body, and Voices for Scotland was funded by the SIC, and we're still very close connected. We're basically the campaigning arm of the SIC. They're about to release transition papers specifically on different topics coming up in the next month, and we will have get-togethers specifically on those transition papers coming up. So we've got one coming up in November, which will actually be around borders with the expert who has written that. So I'm hoping that we'll get to the point where we'll have more specific ones as well as the more generic ones. But no, I appreciate the feedback. That's really helpful.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else got any questions just now? Let me just, oh yeah, wait, we've got Michael Picken raised a hand. Let me just find you quickly.
I've unmuted.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay. I live in I've lived in Scotland for 4 years. I'm English through and through, hundreds of years of English ancestors, and I've always lived in England until now. My support for Scottish independence is basically to kick in the teeth of the British state. And you know, I lived in Liverpool, where a lot of people think likewise. Even more so after developments in recent days. I used to work in Manchester. You know, the British state is a totally undemocratic prison, and it's time to break free. And the fact that Scotland has a national identity, to my mind, and the fact that it had this Act of Union gives it an escape from the British state. Unfortunately, apart from Wales and the whole of Ireland, you know, it's a bit hard for the English people to break free of the state, but it then becomes a question. But so my support for Scottish independence is predicated on that, and therefore I take a slightly different view to the ways in which these things have been discussing. The idea of having a draft constitution and circulating it, I think it puts things completely the wrong way around. If Scotland is to become an independent state, then the best way of dealing with the constitution, the written constitution, is to have an election for a constituent assembly or a constitutional assembly, and then for people to put their alternative views forward to the electorate about what should be in that constitution, and then people elect them on the basis of what they think should be in the constitution. They go away and write a constitution, and then it's put to the people to decide. That's the way in which I'd see it. And the draft constitution, you know, I realise it's a draft and it's always going to have something that people disagree with, but it seems to me to have less rights than people have in Scotland at the moment. If you're Japanese and you live in Scotland, you've got the right to vote. You can't have the right to vote under this constitution unless you would take out Scottish citizenship. You have to have 5 years work experience in order to become a member of the parliament. That would have, you know, Murray Black would have never got elected, my MP, if that rule had been enforced. So, you know, that you can find faults in any constitution, but, you know, there has to be a proper democratic debate about it. And some of those are fundamental issues, like should we have private property and private ownership of land? Yeah. These are big fundamental questions. And without that kind of, you know, okay, we have a referendum and people then agree to have an independent Scotland, that a whole process then opens up. Now, Jerry's also been talking about the process of disentanglement from the British state. Now, the Irish government decided it didn't want any of the debt, but it also decided it didn't want any of the assets. And the assets of the British state are absolutely huge. Oh, exactly. You know, the crown jewels alone, of which we should be entitled to a tenth of, that's right, are worth billions of pounds. So, you know, it's not automatically the case that you want to be debt-free if you form an independent Scotland. So the process, how would you see the negotiation of that process of disentanglement being agreed and finalised by the British state? Because the existing Scottish Parliament has been elected to run the devolved settlement. It's not been elected to negotiate with the British state about whether we have the crown jewels or not.
There's a great point you just touched on there, by the way, which is and I was trying to see if I could get an assessment for this book on Scotland. I say notionally after the Scotland, but is that UK's wealth and the UK's GDP. Well, the difference between the UK's GDP and UK's wealth, but because of, this is obviously a guesstimate done by people because of the amount of hidden wealth, is about the wealth of the UK is about 6 times the size of its notional GDP because of the amount of kind of offshore things. And obviously, if you get to Scotland was, and I was speaking to Danny Dorling about this publicly, and he said, obviously, in terms of Scotland's financial interests and so on, and financial institutions, it would be broadly, our wealth would be about 5 to 6 times what our GDP is. And it just makes you think about the many Scotlands there are. You know, like there's a maritime Scotland, so it's much bigger. And really, relating to the point you're making about assets, we're probably going to have to do an inventory of assets and the wealth of Scotland in entanglement. I do think, I mean, but first point is, I do think like a draft constitution pre-disunion rather is perfectly fine. I do think the nature of how the the breakup happens is we have to, as a friend of mine that put this a couple of years ago, he said, we have to imagine it in a way of, he put it as bluntly, he says, rather than saying, as some people will say, fuck off, it's the nature of a goodbye and a hello in a sense. Scotland's breaking apart is a hello and an introduction to the global world. And so we have to do that in a way that maintains relationships with large parts of the rest of England. We're obviously going to have some element of political cooperation, so on. So I think that has to be carefully planned out. I mean, I do find it fascinating that even in 2014, some of my pro-union friends actually said to me, and they were being serious, they didn't want independence because they feared the British state would be punitive post-independence. And I just said to them, this is a terrible argument. Somehow there was a deal done with Ireland, etc. And it does make you think that given how the UK state's operated since 2016, that there's an element of truth in that. But it doesn't then mean you don't go for it. Just as a other quick point, just in terms of timing, we've got left. I do think one of the biggest things is in the IndyRef, I came up with the term missing million in terms of people that hadn't voted in a generation who previously had voted. There was an ended focus groups of non-voters in Dundee and Glasgow, and there was an assumption by both yes and no camps, which I think is just typical of political campaigns, that because people then turned out to vote once in an IndyRef, that was that issue sorted. Whereas we have 50% historic turnouts for Scottish Parliament elections, we have terrible turnouts for local government elections, and the missing Scotland are even more obviously a set of issues in wider public society and so on. And it's something we just, in all our talk about constitutionalism, Scotland as a democracy, the UK not as a democracy, just that there's a large part of Scotland missing from the most basic threshold of this debate, which is voting. And the Labour Party failed Scotland on that, and the SNP haven't, they haven't come to where they should on that. And there is the issue there, of course, a missing centre-left force to the left of the SNP, which obviously the SSP were at one point, maybe Labour were at one point, Labour blowing themselves up, that doesn't help our politics either there. So I just think we need to think of the voices that are missing from our debates that won't be answered just, I know you weren't meaning it that way, but won't be answered just by making new constitutions. We need to think about wider democracy.
Super, muted. I muted myself, sorry. Thanks so much. We're at 7 o'clock, or almost 7 o'clock now, but I know Norman's raising his hand to ask a question. And we've got also another question from Jane. Okay, I'm going to do Norman very quickly, and I'm going to do this thing where I'm going to ask Jerry to answer in 1 minute, and the same for Jane's question, so we get through. But before I do that, I was asked to say hello to, let me check again, to Lauren, who's watching us from Seattle. So, hi, Lauren. Okay, so Norman, you go first, and you get very short time to ask your question, and very quick for Jerry to answer.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a matter that I'm involved in insofar as I've donated money to it. But it occurred to me, all this conversation about direct democracy and people acting independent of big government and so on. What's your view, Jerry, of the People's Action on Section 30?
Okay, I'm not really sure about it in a sense. In that, right, to have an independence referendum, it has to be fully legally watertight, etc. Right? It doesn't mean completely we go down the same route as before. There are many things, again, about my point about SNP and strategies. There's ways of asking different questions. There's the Supreme Court route as well. But I'm a bit wary of it, to be honest with you, in a sense. I think it might be it might be a diversion in a way, but I do totally obviously understand and respect the reasoning and feeling people have. We clearly cannot be. I mean, I think, just to get to the third thing, the union is right on some level, whatever some people might think, it is based on consent, right? And if the union continually says no to Scotland, that just comes at political cost to them. That comes on political cost of attrition of the union. If they make independence completely synonymous with democracy, it's kind of goodbye. It's kind of like, that's it, folks. We can all go home. We still need to have an independence referendum somehow. But certainly, I knew that some of the Theresa May team on Scotland, and they actually knew that. I'm not quite sure the Boris Johnson team does at all. But so I'm in a way sanguine in a way about how we get from where we are here to an independence vote it might be a bumpy ride, and good luck in your endeavours.
Super. Okay, Jane, you get to ask your question quickly, and then we're finishing almost on time.
I'm sorry, I've had one already, apologise, but a very quick thing about citizens' assemblies and the missing millions you talked about, Jerry. I have a bit of a dislike about citizens' assemblies, not because in themselves they can be very useful, but I think as a kind of wonderful new shiny idea, I think it's not the way to go. They cost a lot of money and they take ages, and it's not always enacted upon, even what they come up with. So I think it's not always as brilliant as we think, but they could be used for some topics. I think what we need is a wider network of popular education, political education network somehow, this kind we've got tonight, but just really widespread. And so the missing millions might get a chance to debate and discuss and come into the kind of whole discussion, really.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm very wary when things, because we all live in messy lives, etc., and very busy lives, and the way anything can sometimes become this like silver gun, whether it's a citizens' assembly. Sometimes some people it's like universal credit, not universal credit, obviously universal income, and I do think there's a thing about we are fundamentally strangers in our own land here. We are not citizens in Scotland. We are not citizens in the UK, and yet somehow we have a tradition that is completely different from the UK that we can draw on. It's a point I made in a book in the NGRF, Caledonian Dreaming, where I said Scotland, like all nations, is a society defined by myths. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But if we want to think those myths, like the egalitarian, story, the democratic intellect story, and popular sovereignty, if we want to be defined by them, we've got to get real on them and act on them. It's going back to the first point, but we do have a different tradition about power in Scotland and where it lies. It's meant to lie with the people, but we've often not acted on it at all. There's people said to me in NGRF, why is popular sovereignty not part of Scottish law? And you go, no, the poll tax would never happen. Thatcher would have never been able to run Scotland the way she did and impose stuff if that had been the case. But we can make those things real and tangible, and abstractions are only relevant, I think, like independence, if they have a connection to real lived life. That's why I'm attracted to independence. A, it's a good principle. B, we are a political community. And C, we already are half independent anyways. So let's go on with it, And I think, I think we will. But we have to measure up to like listening to the people who are not yet convinced, the people who are the people who voted no. And a lot of them were even open in 2014, and they're even more open now. And I know several friends who are just waiting to wanting to be at that point where they vote for and believe in and support independence. But they need a little bit more, a little bit more of a human offer that acknowledges the honesty in the journey we're on.
What a beautiful sentence to end this night on. That was really nice. So now I don't have to do it. But yeah, I think we're going to end now because I know people will probably have their tea ready or other things to get on with. But Jerry, thank you so much for joining us tonight and offering your expertise. It's been absolutely brilliant listening to you, and also brilliant to listen to everyone else's points to the conversation. Really enjoyed that. As always, I'm going to do my little fundraising bit at the end. So if you can help us keep these conversations going, please consider helping us out financially, or also again via sharing and liking our things on social media. And we've got an exciting next session next week coming up on Thursday with Sir Jeff Palmer on Scotland's history and past and how we can learn from that for the future. So I might see some of you then. And otherwise, just keep your eyes open for our upcoming sessions in November. So thanks very much for joining us. And again, Jerry, thanks so much.
Thank you, Clara.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.